Thanks. My name is Kevon Martis. I'm the director of the Interstate Informed Citizens Coalition. We're from Blissfield, Michigan. We are a nonpartisan or bipartisan group. About 40% of our supporters across the state of Michigan are Democrats and self-described liberals. But we also regularly work with groups like the Americans for Prosperity, the Mackinac Center, and the Center-Right Coalition, and other groups who support science-based energy policy rather than policy derived from lobbyists. I've heard Rob's talk several times from other presenters, though frankly Rob's the first Republican that I've heard make some of these points. There, that's the last shot. I'll be kind. And frankly, you know, because we're bipartisan, you should never be able to guess where my own loyalties lie. I'll keep this strictly off the record. Bottom line is policy affects people. I've heard Detroit Edison and the Michigan Energy, Michigan Jobs folk talk about turbines, talk about this proposal, Proposal 3, but none of them bring pictures of the reality of what these turbines bring. Those of you in this area who live in this area can understand this. Some of you will like them, some of you will not. I understand that. But the bottom line is policy affects people. This is the Schimmeldecker home in Ludington, Michigan, in that Lake Winds park that Rob was mentioning. That's a 476-foot V100 turbine, just a little smaller than the V100s up the road here in Minden City. It's 1,139 feet from the house. That's 500 feet closer than Vestas recommends their employees reside in case of a failure of the turbine. These are being sited unsafely across the state, but I'm not here to talk about the land use policy, but I will say the reason I got into this is because I was on a planning commission in Lenawee County where the same kind of development was proposed in our area. CMS, we talk about tax benefits. Will Mason County profit? Yeah, but CMS is doing better. They got a $73 million check from the Obama stimulus package. That's 30% of the upfront cost to build this project. I don't see anything free market or libertarian in that. That's redistribution of other people's money into somebody else's pockets. This is up the road here in Pigeon. You can see it makes a radical change. And we'll be talking, the MEMJ guys are talking 2,500 turbines. Detroit Edison's folks are talking 3,100. My number's coming in somewhere between 4,000 and 5,000 turbines. Now that would average out to about 60 in every county, but what Huron County has discovered is Huron, Sanilac, Bay, Tuscola counties are likely to become sacrifice zones for these projects because you're going to squeeze these in where the best wind is available. We're going to be looking at a lot of these. Huron County commissioners came out and are unanimously opposing Proposal 3, as is Michigan Farm Bureau, which supported the 10% push. Mark Schauer's Green Bargain, 25 by 25. I have a deal for you. The folks backing this Proposal 3 are almost all from out of state. Green Tech Action Fund in California and the Natural Resource Defense Council in New York. Most of the money behind this, about $2 million out of the $2.3 million, is from out of state. There's nothing grassroots about this push. Why is Michigan in a bullseye? This is part of a national strategy by AWEA and the Sierra Club and others. You can see Michigan is a priority 1 state for renewables, especially the 25 by 25 proposal. Sierra Club says if successful, the Michigan initiative will send an important signal to the nation that public desire to move towards green energy remains strong. We're poster children for a larger national green energy cause. In a nutshell, I won't dwell on this too much. Rob already brought it up. 25% of retail sales shall be renewables from inside the state of Michigan, et cetera, et cetera. 1% rate cap. The other things are interesting, but we are the only state in the union that would have a constitutional mandate for this. And it's true, other states do have large renewable mandates. None of them required a constitutional amendment to get there, which means we certainly don't need one here. Let's look at Michigan's current production. Almost 50% of our production in Michigan today is low emissions. It's either 29% nuclear, which has no emissions, unless the thing fails, of course. There could be emissions. That's not happening in the U.S. We have a fair amount of natural gas, which is far cleaner than coal, and our percentage of that is increasing. And the rest is bio and hydro, but you see wind doesn't even show up on this chart in 2011. That's because in 2011, still less than 1% of our energy came from wind in the state of Michigan. It didn't even break the 0.5% barrier, so it would show up in the EIA statistics. Remember, despite the talk about biomass and solar being part of this, Doug Jester himself of Michigan Energy, Michigan Jobs concedes that this is a wind mandate. This will be nothing but turbines. Will we see token advances in some of the other things? Perhaps, but in Michigan this will mean one thing, wind turbines, and lots of them. Here's the secret energy policy of 25 by 25 that they don't talk about openly. But in Michigan, because of intermittency, as is true anywhere, our only backup or complement for wind is fossil fuel. And in Michigan, because of our low capacity factor, which is how often the turbines produce as a percentage of their nameplate rating, it's only about 25% according to EIA data. The rest of it in Michigan is likely to be gas. So if we really want to have indigenous production of our energy, this is going to be 1 part wind, 3 parts fracking. There's environmental cost at all phases of energy production, but wind is never working alone. Why is it a 1-to-3 ratio of wind to fossil, or in this case natural gas? Well, let's take the city of Kalamazoo. It could be Sandusky, it could be Bad Axe, pick your own city. Let's assume they have 1,000 megawatts of relentless demand that has to be satisfied all day long, or they'll have blackouts. There's no option. You have to produce that energy no matter what. I don't believe that number is accurate for Kalamazoo or Deckerville or anywhere else. But let's try coal. If we want to satisfy that 1,000 megawatts of demand, never-ending, ceaseless, relentless demand with a 1,000 megawatt coal plant, 90% of the time that power would be there. 10% of the time they'd be shut down for maintenance or so forth, but it's typically on a human schedule where you say, okay, in 60 days we're going to shut down, we're going to change this boiler, we're going to do this. It's controllable by humans. Oops, did I miss one? Let's try wind. Now suppose we want to do 1,000 megawatts of wind instead of coal. What will we have to do? First, we need 555 turbines. That's far more than we have in Huron County today. Yet they could only reliably meet 25%. This 1,000 megawatts could only meet 25% of that demand over a year because the wind blows so seldom. And at any point in the future, only 11% of that demand can be reliably predicted to be there. What does this mean? The only way we can replace 1,000 watts of coal with wind is by adding a 1,000 megawatt gas turbine for the 75% that wind we know will not meet year in, year out. On an annual basis, 75% of that capacity will be met by a fossil fuel plant in Michigan. Nuclear can't do it because it won't cycle up and down, and wind's output varies radically. We've seen on the West Coast 2,000 megawatts of production wind shift in 20 minutes, which is the equivalent of 2 Fermi 2 nuke plants turning on and turning off in 20 minutes. That's tremendously difficult for the wind operators to deal with without curtailing the wind. There's another story behind that, we don't have time. Bottom line is 75%, if we replace that, we're going to build 1 turbine and 3 additional megawatts of gas capacity. But if you look an hour into the future, 6 weeks into the future, you make a prediction about how much wind can I rely being there. If I'm running the grid and I got to keep Kalamazoo fired up, I got to have energy there. I'm looking out 6 weeks out. How much can I depend? How much of that capacity is going to be there? The utilities are telling us only 11%. So out of 1,000 megawatts, you're only going to have 110 available, which means that gas plant now has to furnish the 89%. But there's another problem. What about July and August? Irene Dimitri of DTE said this a few weeks ago in Ann Arbor. She said, in July and August, during the heat wave, wind was giving us one big goose egg. So you shut your coal plant off, you're going to get 1,000 megawatts of that capacity from natural gas. So, for every 1,000 megawatts wind, there must be at least 750 megawatts fossil on the grid for our annual needs, but 1,000 megawatts of fossil for our hourly needs. So the ratio between wind and fossil could be as much as 1 to 1. For every megawatt of wind, you're going to have 1 megawatt of fossil fuel available. What's that mean? We're going to pay twice. Whenever we talk about wind becoming cheaper than new coal, it's an irrelevant comparison because there's no such thing as wind by itself. Whatever wind's cost is today, and despite the happy talk we're seeing from the promoters, wind's true cost exceeds $120 a megawatt hour. They're selling contracts for less than that, but it's only because they're hiding the subsidies necessary to get there. These subsidies are often greater than the wholesale cost of energy as sold into the grid. Whatever that cost is of wind, you're going to add another $100, $110 a megawatt for natural gas on top. Wind is not cheaper than coal, it's not cheaper than gas because it can't function without one or the other added to it. Here's something that ratepayers are never told, and we do not have easy access to this information. We don't have a simple place to look and see what is wind's capacity factor in Huron County today. We have no way to figure that out. We're paying for the things, but there is no website to go to and say, what's the Minden City turbines producing today? We don't know. How much fossil fuel has wind actually saved? We've had a number of years of wind in operation across the country. There is no empirical data to show us that we've reduced any meaningful amounts of fossil fuel. We should be able to go to a website as the ratepayers and taxpayers who are supporting this and say, how much have we throttled back our coal plants today? How much of that $1.7, $1.8 billion worth of coal were we able to send back to Wyoming today? Because the wind is spinning. We don't have access to that data. We don't know how much the turbines cost year in, year out to operate. The numbers used to be 10 cents a megawatt hour. The latest numbers are showing 20 cents a megawatt hour. We'll know here in Minden City and in Ubley and in Elkton, around 10 years, Detroit Edison is predicting the cranes are going to roll back in and you're going to be changing out gearboxes in each of those turbines. They project only a 10-year life expectancy and they're $450,000 a turbine to change those out. There's other things there. The bottom line is this data does not exist or it's declared proprietary. We can't get access to that number in an easily accessible form despite us being the ones paying for it. And do we pay for it? Yes. Here's the subsidies. 2007, coal, nuclear, nat gas, hydro all got between 50 cents and $1.50 per megawatt hour in subsidies, while wind got $23.37 in subsidies. There's nothing free market about that. Did they learn their lesson in 2010? No. 53 bucks, compliments of the stimulus package, versus the other one somewhere between 60 and 278. Wind is not sustainable unless your checkbook is sustainable. How about the total subsidies? In aggregate in 2010, wind got $5 billion in total subsidies, more than all other forms of production combined. You heard Romney talk about that, $90 billion invested in wind already. At some point, this is a mature technology that should not need any further government subsidy. In fact, Energy Secretary Chu has already proclaimed it a mature technology, yet OEA is pounding the table, we need more subsidies. Michigan is paying the highest utility rates in the region. It's true, there is a 1% rate cap. Those caps have been tried in other places, and it's simple to evade. It may very well be determined to be illegal, but it's simple enough to evade. You just don't call it a rate increase, you call it a fee. And that's happening in other places. You're passing those costs through. Remember, nobody else is going to pay for this in the end except you and me. Let's see. In DTE's estimates, this is going to cost 4 to 5% a year, not just 1% to implement. And the increased rate increases that the utilities are asking for today, this will be additive on top of them. This will not be in place of. If they're asking for 10%, MPSC gives it, you're going to add this on top. Is wind cheaper? Well, not that we're seeing in practice. Denmark has 24% wind and they're paying 36 cents a kilowatt hour, while US has 2% wind, we're paying 12%. The trend is clear. As you increase the percentage of wind production in your nation, the cost per kilowatt hour increases. Probably the most amazing example is in Germany. They panicked after the Fukushima disaster and said, we got to get rid of these nuke plants. We're going to go all wind, all solar, all renewables. They shut the nukes down. They're now in the process of building 23 new coal-fired plants because wind is so intermittent it's not working. They're going to have increased emissions in Germany as a result of walking away from nuclear and adding wind. Energy sprawl. We currently have only 300 turbines or so online. Like I said, we're going to be looking in excess of 4,000. Capacity factors will drop because as the good areas like the tip of the thumb are filled to capacity, they're going to be pushed into marginal areas. We're already hearing utilities say down in Hillsdale County, the only reason we're trying to build turbines here is because all the good areas have already been leased up. The cost per kilowatt will rise as they stretch into weak wind areas. Have you seen here? 36 square miles of this. This is what they were proposing in my township. A 80 megawatt installation. Exelon, who's working up here, proposed 80 megawatts, 45 V100 turbines. Guess what? 36 square miles of this could be replaced. Oops, did I do the wrong thing? Could be replaced with one of these semi-trailer mounted open cycle gas turbines that you could hide in your average dairy barn. 36 square miles replaced by this. And this can be fired by natural gas from the state of Michigan. What about energy density? Here's the Fermi 2 plant, 1,100 megawatts, about a 90% capacity factor, runs day and night. A friend of mine works there. He's never come home glowing in the dark. There's time. If we wanted to replace those with the V100s like Minden City at 2 per square mile, which is what Exelon is doing these days, we'd have to fill that entire radius, a semicircle, with turbines at the rate of 2 per square mile. Starting in Newport, all the way to Toledo, to Detroit, and almost to Ann Arbor. That would have to be solid with nothing but V100 turbines. But you still couldn't get rid of Fermi because in July and August, they're not going to spin. Impacts on heavy industry. The Steel Manufacturers Association has said, look, Electric arc furnace-based steel production is an energy-intensive process that requires reliable and economically competitive energy supplies. The U.S. steel industry spends over $18 billion annually for electricity, and energy constitutes up to 15% of the cost, et cetera, et cetera. What's that mean? $18 billion a year spread across the entire United States is what the steel industry spends on electricity. If these policies, green policies, drive the cost of that energy up 10%, that's an additional $1.8 billion per year in cost to the manufacturer. Divided by 100,000 steel employees, that's $18,000 a year no longer available for union wages, fringes, and benefits. University of Michigan, you got a kid headed to college? I graduated from Michigan. Denard looked awful good this Saturday. U of M spends $60 million a year on electricity. I emailed them, they said, oh, you're an alum, here, yeah, take the data. A 10% increase is $6 million a year to the University of Michigan. They either raise tuition, $143 a student, or they can lay off 187 teaching assistants to meet the budget deficit. What about CO2? What about mercury? What about the environment? Well, interestingly enough, these cavemen are sitting here saying something's just not right. Our air is clean. Our water is pure, we all get plenty of exercise, everything we eat is organic and free range, and yet nobody lives past 30. That's my point. Wind has never been proven to reduce CO2. The Bentech study in Colorado actually showed an increase in pollutants with higher wind penetrations because you're making the coal plants cycle more often. Michigan wind will never replace baseload fossil in any meaningful way. Worse yet, if we had $1 billion to spend on CO2 reduction, we would achieve 9 times the reduction by replacing coal plants with gas than we will by spending that $1 billion on wind turbines. If emissions are your big thing, you should be pushing gas instead of coal right now, instead of wind. In fact, the price of wind would have to get up to over gas would have to get up to over $20 to make wind competitive in terms of reducing emissions. Right now it's $3. What about external costs of fossil, like Rob was referring to? Only 2% of Liberians have access to power. They heat and cook with wood and dung. Those with power are paying 54 cents a kilowatt hour, the world's highest rate. A new fossil plant could produce it for less than 10 cents. Yet the Sierra Club thinks we should ban fossil fuel. You see, this boy might get asthma. I think he's got bigger worries than asthma. My point is, energy poverty has grave consequences as well. Green policies make energy poverty a larger issue. The UK is counting 2,000 to 3,000 deaths a year in the United Kingdom from energy poverty. How about coal increased asthma? This is the city of Toledo in 1912. Can't see the horizon. Coal, so the point is, our increased use of coal has resulted in more emissions, more pollution that are resulting in more asthma, et cetera, et cetera. We have one serious piece of evidence that we need to deal with. Toledo 1912, Toledo 2012. If the correlation is coal emissions, we have to explain this. The truth is, our use of coal has increased 180% for electricity production since the early 70s, yet our emissions have dropped 60% and will continue to do so. Now quickly, a couple of these, this is Mr. Jester and Mr. Schauer. These are the guys pushing this proposal. What about their claims? The $1.8 billion in imported coal is bad for Michigan. Rob basically said the same thing. We got to wean ourselves onto this dependence from foreign coal, as if it's Iraq or Saudi Arabia or some such thing. I think what they want, the headlines or the message they want us to receive is this: stop the Wyoming train of death, as they import black death from Wyoming. But we don't treat other commodities from out of state this way. How about the California raisins? Are we also proposing an embargo against them? Maybe the ads there would say, stop California's raisins of death. I mean, it sounds like a nice argument, but I think it's meant to bring up other imagery. What if Pennsylvania reciprocated and said, let's ban Michigan imported iron ore? Maybe their headlines would say, keep filthy Michigan iron out of Pennsylvania. Reality check. Free interstate commerce is what makes us strong as a nation. Why do we import coal from West Virginia and Wyoming? They're the low-cost, high-efficiency producers, and we don't have any. Just like Michigan is the low-cost, high-efficiency producer of automobiles. Doug Jester suggests that by 2025, Proposal 3 may reduce coal imports by $400 million a year, but that will be replaced by $1.5 billion a year using my IICC numbers in imported turbine parts, gas turbines, and out-of-state natural gas imports. If every state were to look at interstate commerce through this phony lens, there would be no interstate commerce. Quickly, wind's getting cheaper. These guys like to point to these power purchase agreements with MPSC. They connect these two data points and say wind is getting inexorably cheaper. They leave off the other half of the graph. The recent 2012 data bounces it back up. If we connect those data points, I could deceptively draw this arrow on here and say, well, the cost of wind's going to infinity. Truth is, cost of wind is pretty stable. Installed cost trends over the long term show that it was much higher in 1982 and it's now trending back up. The industry experts are all projecting the same thing. This is my favorite. Iowa's at 20% wind. We're losing. We're going to lose the race with Iowa. There's a serious problem. See all that purple? That's really high-powered wind compared to Michigan. See any purple? Every time you raise the wind speed, the power available for a turbine goes up by the cube of that number. Every turbine in Iowa has access to twice the amount of energy that a turbine has in Michigan, which means if we went 100% wind in each state, their energy would cost 1/2 of what ours costs. What if we said the same thing about hydro? Iowa has hydro. We're losing. Well, that's true. They have the Mississippi River, and we have the Grand River. So why don't we do the same thing? Well, we have. Their dam in the Mississippi River makes 120 megawatts. Our dam in the Grand River makes 3. Neither race is one Michigan can win. Iowa is the Mississippi River of wind. Michigan is the Grand River of wind. We can't win that race. Wind jobs, quickly. $9 billion in stimulus for solar wind projects, made 910 final jobs, $9.8 million per job. Great gig if you can get it. The new Mackinac study, Rob's correct. Can you buy what you want out of a study? Perhaps. But it's a much different conclusion the Michigan State study came up with. They're projecting job losses of up to 11,000, increased electricity prices by 15 to 16%, lower disposable income by more than 1.3 billion, and I disagree with this study in a number of ways because it's far too generous to wind. I think it will be far worse. Chris Horner is an expert on energy policy. He says this: there is nothing, no program, no hobby, no vice, no crime that does not create jobs. Tsunamis, computer viruses, and shooting convenience store clerks all create jobs. So that claim misses the point. Because job creation applies, that argument is in support of everything, it's also an argument in favor of none. Instead of an argument on the merits, it is an admission that one has no such meritorious arguments. Somebody said that Milton Friedman observed a drainage canal project taking place in the Middle East, and they were digging the ditches with shovels. He says to the overseer, why aren't you using earth-moving equipment? He says, well, this creates more jobs. He says, well, then why don't you make them use teaspoons? Bottom line, wind energy can meet almost none of its claims. It is not able to significantly reduce emissions due to intermittency. It's a 1-to-3 ratio of wind to fossil. It is outrageously expensive and redundant. The capital dislocation and utility rate increases virtually guarantee significant job losses. Michigan's wind resource is so poor we are at a regional disadvantage and will always be a high-cost producer. A couple quick notes. Renewable energies once had a 100% market share in the United States, corresponding to mankind's energy poverty era, like the 1700s. We were all renewable then. And finally, if you are anti-coal, anti-nuke, and anti-gas, you are pro-darkness. Thank you.